It was a cloudy day, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. The woman, whose name was Emily, was driving to a job interview in a small town she had never been to before. She had spent the past few days preparing for the interview, going over her resume and rehearsing answers to common questions. As she drove into the town, she noticed that there were hardly any people around. The streets were deserted, and the buildings looked old and abandoned. Emily wondered if the town was dying or if everyone was just out of town. She pulled up to the address of the office where her interview was supposed to be, but it was nowhere to be found. The building was gone, as if it had never existed. Emily was confused and a little scared. She looked around and noticed that the town seemed different than it did when she first drove in. The streets were narrower, and the buildings were closer together. It was as if the town was closing in on her. She decided to ask for directions and drove around for a few minutes until she saw a small group of people gathered outside a convenience store. She parked her car and approached them, asking if they knew where the office was. They looked at her with blank expressions, as if they didn't understand what she was saying. One of the men spoke up, "Lady, there's no office here. This town doesn't exist." Emily was taken aback by the man's words. "What do you mean it doesn't exist? I just drove in here. There are buildings and streets." The man looked at her with a sad expression. "You don't understand. This town is cursed. People come in, but they can't leave. They're trapped here forever." Emily didn't know what to make of the man's words. She felt a chill run down her spine. She looked around and saw that the other people had gathered around her, all with the same blank expressions. Suddenly, a loud siren blared out, and Emily looked up to see that the sky was darkening. The clouds had turned a sickly green color, and the wind had picked up. The people around her started to run, and Emily followed them. They all ran to a large building at the edge of town. It was a church, and the doors were open. The people ran inside, and Emily followed them. The inside of the church was dimly lit, and there were candles burning on the altar. The people huddled together in fear as the storm raged outside. Emily tried to talk to them, but they were all silent. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, the candles on the altar went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Emily heard a low growling sound, and she felt something brush against her leg. She screamed and tried to run, but she tripped over something and fell. When she looked up, she saw that she was in a small room. It was a cell, with no windows and a heavy metal door. She pounded on the door, but it was solid. She was trapped. Emily spent what felt like hours in the cell, trying to find a way out. She screamed until her throat was raw, but no one came. She felt like she was going insane. Finally, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was wearing a dark robe, and his face was hidden in the shadows. "Welcome, Emily," he said in a deep voice. "I've been waiting for you." Emily felt a wave of fear wash over her. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man stepped forward, and Emily saw that he was holding a knife. "You're here to be a sacrifice, my dear. A sacrifice to the darkness." Emily tried to back away, but the cell was too small. She was trapped with the man, and there was nowhere to run. The man started chanting in a language Emily didn't understand. The room grew colder, and Emily could see her breath in the air. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and the man disappeared. Emily was alone in the cell, and she didn't know what to do. She sat down in a corner and started to cry. She had never felt so alone and afraid in her life. She didn't know what was happening or why she was there. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and a group of people walked in. They were dressed in strange clothes and had odd symbols painted on their faces. Emily didn't recognize any of them, but they seemed familiar. The group of people didn't say anything to her. They just stood around her and started to chant in the same language as the man before. Emily felt a strange sensation wash over her, and she felt like she was being pulled towards something. Suddenly, there was another flash of light, and Emily found herself outside the church. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear. She looked around and saw that the town was back to normal. The buildings were new, and there were people walking around. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She thought that it had all been a nightmare. But then she realized that she was still wearing the same clothes she had been wearing when she drove into the town. Her car was still parked outside the convenience store. She walked back to her car and tried to start it, but it wouldn't start. She looked under the hood and saw that the engine was missing. It was as if it had been taken out. Emily was starting to panic. She didn't know what was happening or why she was still there. She walked around the town, trying to find someone to help her, but no one would talk to her. They all looked at her with the same blank expressions as before. Emily felt like she was going insane. She didn't know what was happening to her or why she was trapped in this town. She thought about the man in the cell and wondered if he was still out there, waiting for her. Days turned into weeks, and Emily was still trapped in the town. She had tried everything she could think of to escape, but nothing had worked. She had started to lose hope that she would ever get out. One day, as she was walking through the town, she saw a group of people gathered around a building. She walked over to see what was happening and saw that there was a sign outside the building that read, "Town Council Meeting." Emily felt a spark of hope. She thought that maybe she could talk to the town council and get them to help her. She walked into the building and saw that there were people sitting at a large table. They all looked up as she walked in. "Can I help you?" one of the men asked. Emily explained her situation, telling them about the man in the cell and the strange group of people who had taken her there. The council members listened intently, but when she finished, they just looked at her with blank expressions. "I'm sorry, miss," one of them said. "But we don't know what you're talking about. This town has never had a prison, and there are no groups like the one you described here." Emily felt like she was going insane. She didn't understand why no one would believe her. She had seen the man in the cell and had felt the darkness in the church. It couldn't have all been in her head. Emily left the council meeting feeling defeated. She wandered aimlessly through the town, trying to come up with a plan. As she walked, she noticed that some of the people she passed looked at her with a mix of fear and disgust. It was as if they knew something about her that she didn't. She stopped in front of a small grocery store and looked at the reflection of her face in the window. She looked pale and thin, and her eyes were sunken in. She looked like a woman who had been lost for a long time. Suddenly, Emily noticed something in the reflection that made her heart skip a beat. She saw a figure standing behind her, just out of focus. She turned around, but there was no one there. She walked into the store, hoping to find some answers. As she wandered through the aisles, she noticed that there was something off about the products on the shelves. The labels were all wrong, and some of the food looked spoiled. She walked up to the counter and saw a woman sitting there, staring at her with a blank expression. Emily tried to speak to her, but the woman just stared. Suddenly, the woman's eyes rolled back into her head, and she started to convulse. Emily tried to help her, but she was pushed away by an unseen force. The woman's body twisted and contorted, and her eyes turned completely black. Emily ran out of the store, terrified. She knew that something was seriously wrong with this town, and she had to get out before it was too late. As she ran through the town, she noticed that the sky was growing darker by the minute. It was as if the town was being consumed by darkness. She knew that she had to find a way out before it was too late. She ran to the outskirts of the town and saw her car parked in the same spot where she had left it. She ran towards it, but as she got closer, she saw that there was something written on the windshield in what looked like blood. It read, "You can never leave." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that she was trapped in this town forever. She collapsed to the ground and started to cry. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around and saw a figure standing behind her. It was the man from the cell. He was smiling at her with his dark, empty eyes. "I told you, my dear," he said. "You are a sacrifice. A sacrifice to the darkness." Emily tried to back away, but she was too weak. The man leaned in close and whispered something in her ear. Emily couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sent shivers down her spine. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and Emily was consumed by darkness. When Emily opened her eyes, she was back on the highway. Her car was parked on the side of the road, and the sun was shining in the sky. At first, she thought it was all a dream, but then she saw that her clothes were covered in dirt and blood. She looked in the mirror and saw that there was a strange symbol etched onto her forehead. Emily knew that she would never forget the town that had vanished. It was a place of darkness and evil, a place where the living and the dead mingled freely. She had been lucky to escape, but she knew that there were others who were not so lucky. As she drove away, she thought about the man in the cell and wondered what he had whispered in her ear. She knew that it was something terrible, something that she would never forget. And as she drove down the highway, she knew that she would never be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Emily tried to forget about the town that had vanished, but she couldn't. The symbol on her forehead served as a constant reminder of what she had experienced. She tried to go back to her normal life, but she found it difficult to concentrate on anything. She quit her job and started to travel, hoping that a change of scenery would help her forget about the town. But no matter where she went, she felt like she was being followed. She would catch glimpses of the man from the cell out of the corner of her eye, and she would hear whispers in her ear when no one was around. Emily started to feel like she was losing her mind. She couldn't sleep, and she was always on edge. She started to see the symbol that was etched on her forehead everywhere she went. It was as if it was burned into her mind. One day, Emily received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to her, but there was no return address. She opened it and saw that it was a map of the town that had vanished. Emily's heart started to race. She didn't know how someone had found out about the town, but she knew that she had to go back. She had to find out what had happened there. Emily packed a bag and drove back to the highway where she had first encountered the town. She parked her car and walked towards where the town had been. As she walked, she noticed that the sky was growing darker by the minute. The same darkness that had consumed the town was now creeping into the surrounding area. She walked for what felt like hours, but the town was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished again. Suddenly, Emily heard a voice behind her. She turned around and saw the man from the cell standing there. "I knew you would come back," he said with a smile. "You can never escape the darkness." Emily tried to back away, but the man was too fast. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her towards him. "I have a gift for you," he said as he leaned in close to her. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and Emily was consumed by darkness once again. When Emily opened her eyes, she was back in the town. The same darkness that had consumed the town was now consuming her. She could feel it wrapping around her, suffocating her. She looked around and saw that she was not alone. There were others there with her. They were all trapped in the darkness, just like she was. Emily knew that they had to find a way out before it was too late. They started to walk through the town, looking for any way out. As they walked, they saw things that made them shiver. There were strange creatures lurking in the shadows, and there were whispers in the wind that promised them eternal darkness. They walked for what felt like hours, but they couldn't find a way out. They were trapped in the darkness forever. Suddenly, Emily saw a light in the distance. It was small, but it was enough to give her hope. She ran towards the light, with the others following behind her. As they got closer, they saw that it was a small church. The door was open, and there was a light coming from inside. Emily ran inside and saw a man standing at the altar. He was holding a candle, and he was surrounded by a warm, comforting light. "Please," Emily begged. "Help us. We're trapped in this darkness." The man smiled at her and nodded. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for you." He led Emily and the others to a small room in the back of the church. The room was dimly lit, but it was warm and inviting. There was a table in the center of the room, and there were chairs arranged around it. The man gestured for Emily and the others to take a seat, and he sat down across from them. "My name is Father Thomas," he said. "I have been waiting for someone like you to come." Emily and the others looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" Emily asked. "I mean that you are not the first to be trapped in this darkness," Father Thomas said. "There have been others before you, and they all came to me for help." "How did they escape?" Emily asked. Father Thomas smiled sadly. "Unfortunately, they did not," he said. "But I have been studying the darkness for many years, and I have found a way to contain it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial. It was filled with a bright, glowing liquid. "This is the key to your escape," he said. "If you drink it, the darkness will be contained, and you will be free." Emily and the others looked at the vial skeptically. "How do we know we can trust you?" one of the others asked. Father Thomas sighed. "I understand your skepticism," he said. "But you must trust me. I am the only one who can help you." Emily looked at the vial and then at Father Thomas. She knew that this was their only chance to escape the darkness. She took the vial and drank the liquid. As she did, she felt a warmth spread through her body. The darkness started to recede, and she could see the light once again. She looked around and saw that the others had also drank the liquid. They were all smiling and laughing, relieved to be free from the darkness. Emily turned to Father Thomas and thanked him. "Thank you so much," she said. "How did you discover this liquid?" Father Thomas smiled. "I have been studying the darkness for many years," he said. "I have found that it can be contained, but it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Emily asked. Father Thomas looked at her gravely. "The sacrifice of a pure soul," he said. "Someone who is willing to give up everything to save others from the darkness." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She realized what Father Thomas was saying. He had created the liquid by sacrificing someone. She looked at the others, and she could see the fear in their eyes. They had all realized the same thing. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Father Thomas stood up and walked over to a small table in the corner of the room. He picked up a small knife and turned back to face them. "Now, we must make another sacrifice," he said. Emily and the others backed away in fear. They knew that they had to escape before it was too late. But Father Thomas was too quick. He lunged forward with the knife, and Emily and the others scattered in all directions. Emily ran towards the door, but it was locked. She pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. She turned around and saw Father Thomas coming towards her with the knife. She backed away, but she was trapped. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the wall behind Emily exploded. She fell to the ground, covered in debris. She looked up and saw a group of men running towards her. They were carrying guns and wearing uniforms. "FBI," one of them shouted. "Freeze!" Father Thomas turned to face them, but it was too late. They tackled him to the ground and restrained him. Emily and the others were rescued and taken to a hospital. They were treated for their injuries and questioned by the authorities about what had happened in the town. They told their story, but no one could explain the strange darkness or Father Thomas's motives. Eventually, Emily was released from the hospital and returned to her normal life. But she could never forget what had happened in that small town. She tried to forget, but the memory of Father Thomas and the darkness haunted her. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reliving the nightmare. She started seeing a therapist, but nothing seemed to help. The memory of the darkness and Father Thomas consumed her, and she felt like she was losing her mind. One day, she received a letter in the mail. It was a letter from Father Thomas. "Dear Emily," the letter read. "I am sorry for what I did. I was consumed by the darkness, and I didn't know how to escape it. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Emily couldn't believe it. She had thought that Father Thomas was locked away for good, but it seemed that he had somehow managed to send her this letter. She read on. "I have found a way to escape the darkness," the letter continued. "But I cannot do it alone. I need your help." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't believe that Father Thomas was asking for her help. She knew that she should throw the letter away and forget about it, but she couldn't resist. She had to know what Father Thomas was planning. She replied to the letter, and a few days later, she received a package in the mail. It contained a map and a note. "Meet me here," the note read. "At midnight, on the night of the new moon. We must act quickly if we are to escape." Emily knew that she shouldn't go, but she couldn't resist. She felt like she had to face Father Thomas one last time. She waited until her husband was asleep and then snuck out of the house. She drove to the location on the map and found Father Thomas waiting for her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "We must act quickly if we are to escape the darkness." Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. Father Thomas led her to a small clearing in the woods. There was a small fire burning in the center, and a group of people were gathered around it. Emily recognized some of them from the small town. They had also been trapped in the darkness. Father Thomas approached the fire and threw a small pouch into it. It burst into flames, and a bright light filled the clearing. Emily shielded her eyes, but when the light faded, she could see that they were no longer in the woods. They were standing in a small church, and there was a bright light shining through the windows. "What is this place?" Emily asked. Father Thomas smiled. "This is the church where I found the liquid that saved us from the darkness," he said. "I have been studying the darkness ever since, and I have found a way to escape it." "How?" Emily asked. Father Thomas walked over to a small altar and picked up a book. It was an old, leather-bound book, and it looked like it had been through a lot. "This book contains the key to our escape," Father Thomas said. "It contains the knowledge of how to banish the darkness forever." He opened the book and began to read. Emily couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the power behind them. She could feel the darkness starting to recede, and she knew that Father Thomas was right. This book held the key to their escape. But then, something strange happened. As Father Thomas continued to read from the book, Emily noticed that the other members of the group began to change. Their eyes grew dark, their skin became pale, and they started to whisper to each other in a language she couldn't understand. "Father Thomas, what's happening?" Emily asked, growing more and more frightened by the second. Father Thomas didn't respond. He was completely focused on the book, his eyes darting back and forth across the pages. Suddenly, Emily felt something cold and slimy wrap around her ankle. She looked down and saw a dark, tentacle-like appendage slithering around her leg. She screamed and tried to pull away, but it was no use. The tentacle was too strong. The other members of the group had started to change as well. They were now completely consumed by the darkness, and they were coming after Emily and Father Thomas. Emily watched in horror as Father Thomas was overtaken by the darkness. His eyes turned completely black, and he began to speak in a voice that was not his own. "Welcome to our world, Emily," he said. "You will never escape." Emily tried to run, but the tentacle around her ankle was too strong. It pulled her towards the darkness, and she was enveloped in a cloud of black smoke. She felt herself being pulled deeper and deeper into the darkness, unable to escape. But then, she heard a voice. A voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, but was also right next to her. "Emily, wake up." Emily opened her eyes to find herself in her own bed, her husband looking down at her with concern. She sat up, panting and sweating. "Everything will be okay, the sacrifice will be over soon," he said, holding her hand tightly as his eyes rolled into the back of his head and his body started to distort. Emily realized it wasn't just a dream, and there was no escape. Emily was finally consumed and forced to live her life at the disappearing town for eternity, a shell of her former self. Consuming any unfortunate soul that may come across the town,